Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, aloha mai kako, ACDA Western. My name is Jace Saplan. My pronouns are both he and they. I'm coming to you from the occupied lands of the Kanaka Maoli here in Hawaii on the island of Oahu. We are here today for our next virtual DEI speaker, and it is my greatest joy to introduce a dear friend of mine, Dr. Alyssa Cossey. Dr. Alyssa Cossey is just an incredible advocate, an incredible educator, an incredible scholar who does so much work in amplifying women's voices and ensuring that choral music education can be a space for everyone. She does this work through the University of Arizona and in so many organizations, such as participating as a member in the Mirbai Choral Ensemble and taking her scholarship and her artistry throughout the country. So it is my greatest pleasure to introduce Dr. Alyssa Cossey, who will be speaking about amplifying women's voices in the Reimagined choral rehearsal. Take it away, Dr. Cossey. It's so good to see you.
You too, and thank you so much for the introduction. Hello, everyone out in Facebook land, or if you're watching this asynchronously, hello. As Jay said, my name is Alyssa Cossey. My pronouns are she, her, and I am joining you from Tucson, Arizona, the occupied lands of the Tohono O'odham and the Pascua Yaqui tribes here in Tucson. I'm really excited to share this session with everybody today, and there's tons to talk about, so I'm just going to jump right in and share my screen and hope that all the technology things work, because magic. All right, that's me, that's the session, we're in the right place. Just really quickly, this is a reminder for anyone who's watching this that my presentation slides are available on my website, as well as a resource list and all sorts of information. So don't have to take notes on every little thing as we go. It'll be available. I just wanted to start this session with this quote because I feel like it really captures how I'm feeling about the world that we're living in right now. And I think maybe a lot of us feel, as those of us invested in trying to really diversify the choral canon. And I think it's also frames this session and my work in a positive manner. Because I think sometimes our work in this area can feel a little bit like we're shaming other people. And I don't think that's the best way to do it. So I like this quote: do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. And I will even point out some of the mistakes that I've made along the way during this presentation, because I am not the expert. No one is the expert. We're working through this all together live. So I just wanted to share that. I'll even point out that Jason and I were talking earlier, that this presentation is constantly evolving. I've done it a few times, and every time I find ways to improve it because I've learned something new, a new resource, a new piece of literature. When I first envisioned this session, it was last summer, and it was more for how to teach in the virtual setting and how to amplify women's voices. And then I realized I need to be inclusive, not just of people, cisgender women, but all women, all people identify. So that's why the X is included, so that it signifies inclusivity and gender inclusivity. All right. The first thing we're going to talk about is the repertoire itself, and that's going to be the focus of this presentation today. And I want to talk about it in a couple different ways. First, I want to talk about positionality. And as choral connectors, I think we need to look at positionality in two different ways. And I really like this definition. It comes from Is Everyone Really Equal? An Introduction to Key Concepts in Social Justice Education. But I think it really helps clarify it in a simple way. Positionality is the recognition that where you stand in relation to others in society shapes what you can see and understand about the world. So how I walk through the world is different than how anyone else walks through it, because I have my own lived experiences and my own identities. I acknowledge that I'm a cisgender woman and white, and I was not raised in the church, and all of these things affect not only how I walk through the world, but how I interact with choral music. I also think we have to acknowledge our position as choral conductors and directors, and that is in a position of power. We stand in front of a group of people and we dictate to them, we create curriculum for them. That's a position of power. And we have to remember that and think about that when we're picking our repertoire. So we're making sure to consider other experiences in our other representations in our repertoire picks. Speaking of representation, one thing to just address really quickly is the idea of representation, not tokenism. I think we've all seen organizations have their like women composer concert, right? They have like a whole concert with all women composers, and then they don't program a woman the entire rest of the year during their regular concerts. So it's just kind of a framework we want to work in and think about as we're going through this. I remember talking to a colleague of mine, and when I was first starting to think about this session and how to present it, and I talked about the fact that like I remember the first time I saw a woman conduct a collegiate choir, and I know what that felt like to see someone who looked like me do something, and it made it seem possible for me to do it. And anybody who's ever had that experience, right? You know that it's in like empowering in so many ways. If you've never had that experience, if you've never had to walk through life and question whether or not there was a space for you in a particular place, then that's something to consider as well when you're thinking about your own identity and your own positionality. Next, I want to talk a little bit about research and score study, and not in the scary way we talk about it in conducting classes, and that, you know, we have to do this harmonic analysis of this entire giant work, and that's still important, and of course you should do that. But I'm speaking specifically to understanding where this material comes from. So it's really important to look back and figure out, what is the source material? Where did this melody come from? What things were going on when it was written? What was the world like? Who was expressing this opinion, this idea? Whose perspective are we sharing with this music? And I want to talk really quickly about this kind of world we're living in right now, this spread of misinformation. And we have access to so much technology and so much knowledge that we never had before. But with it kind of comes this like overwhelming feeling. Like, I don't know if anyone else feels that way, but how can you keep up? How can you stay atop of all of the information? But one of the things I think we see in public spaces and in media is something that we also do in the choral profession, which is, oh, someone I know and respect told me this piece was a good piece to do, so I'm going to do it. And then we don't do our own work. We don't do our own research into it. And I am 100% guilty of that, right? I had one of the pieces we'll talk about today was recommended to me by a mentor of mine. And this is a person whose opinion I absolutely respected. And so I did this piece and I didn't do my work. And that's not on this person, it's on me. I didn't do my work. And now I have, and I'm going to do better. So I'm not going to do that piece anymore. Lastly, when you're thinking about repertoire, I also think we have to consider our audience and our audience needs. And not so much just in the way that I think traditionally we talk about it in choral methods classes, like you want to have an engaging concert, you want to program different types of music, you know, that kind of stuff. But also, you know, what does our audience need to hear? And you as an individual person have to make that choice for yourself about how implicit or explicit you're going to be in your representation in your repertoire. But I always think about, I tell the story that I was conducting honor choir right before, you know, the world shut down last March. And I had programmed What Happens When a Woman. And it was in the SATB choir, but the sopranos and altos sang a piece and the tenors and basses sang a piece by themselves. And I had the sopranos and altos come all the way out onto the apron on the stage and present it in a really like forward aggressive kind of manner. And my husband was in the audience at the performance, and he told me afterwards that he was sitting behind a cowboy. I still live in the Wild West in southern Tucson, and like big 10-gallon hats, the whole thing, kind of the drawl. And he said that after that song, he leaned over to someone who was with him, his wife, a friend, I don't know, and said, well, I don't know about that, like after the song. And I think that's fine. We might not have been able to change that person's mind on that day about women's place in the world and their ability to be leaders. But maybe it sparked something. Maybe it's a conversation that he would have later with his daughter or granddaughter or whomever was in that ensemble that he was there to see. So it's just something to consider. And sorry, I have to check my notes because I can't remember everything. Oh, the other thing is thinking about this session, right? I'm doing this live, and really Jace and I are here on Zoom, but we're not in the same place. Our performances are that way as well, right? Our audience is no longer just the people who show up to our physical performances. Hopefully we get to have those again soon. But our performances live on now in YouTube, and they're shareable and accessible. So our audience is even bigger than it ever used to be. And that's something we have to consider as well. All right, moving on to, this is sort of a checklist. It's what I kind of go to when I'm programming. And even recently, like in December of 2020, I was trying to pick a piece for our winter concert. And I went through my own list and I was like, ooh, I can find a better piece. So I don't know if it's helpful to anyone else, but these are just some questions that I like to ask myself when I'm programming. And so I look at a piece and I ask myself, is this the only arrangement or version of this piece? And if it's not, is it the best representation of that particular genre, style, or perspective? If the answer is no, then I'm going to put it away and find something else. You know, as choral conductors, you know, and me personally, I'm really textually driven. So I find texts that I am inspired by, and I piece my programs together that way. But is there another setting of that text, another arrangement of it that might be better? Also, is this piece representative of a non-Eurocentric country, region, or culture? If it is, we have to ask ourselves, what experience and research has this composer or arranger done to make them an expert? Did they grow up? That is a part of their personal experience, their personal identity? Or are they someone who has studied it extensively, been to these places, made it a part of their professional experience to truly learn as much as possible about a different culture? If not, then maybe we need to find something that is written by someone who truly identifies that way or has done the work. I also think we have to ask ourselves this question, and we'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about some suggested repertoire, but whose perspective is presented via the text in this particular piece? Is the poetry written by a person who identifies as female, but then set by a male identifying composer? I think this happens a lot in choral music. I mean, think about how many arrangements of Emily Dickinson or Christina Rossetti poems there are that are written by men. And Sandra Snow made a comment one time that really stuck with me. And she talked about, if you have a choice, would you feature a text that centers women's lived experiences over men's narration of women's experiences? And I feel like that quote has like really stuck with me and helps me think about that when I'm programming. Does your program represent any marginalized perspectives? If not, then we have to go back and find something that does. You also want to ask, does this piece contain any problematic text? And problematic text can be all sorts of things. We'll talk about two pieces today in particular that have problematic context or text. One question you can ask yourselves is it something that could be omitted or altered? Sometimes it's a great piece. Pedagogically, it works for your students. It's accessible, right? Like we all the other things we have to think about, but there's like one line of text that's not appropriate in the 2021 world that we're living in. Is that something that could be changed, altered, or omitted? Or is it a piece that should be absolutely just scrapped because it's not worth reviving a piece like this? There's things to ask yourself. So let's talk about some things that I think are awesome and great representations. One of them is, I'll just put this up. When I talk about amplifying women's voices, I think the first thing that comes to people's minds are treble choirs. And women conductors and women composers writing for treble choirs. It's like a really small niche of choral music. And so some of the stuff I'm going to share today is about amplifying women's voices in other settings. SATB choirs should be singing music written by women. TTB choirs should be singing music written by women, right? We make treble choirs sing music written by tenor or bass voices all the time. And so it's time for us to really evaluate that and look at that and stop aligning women composers with treble music, right? Because they're not exclusive and everyone needs to have that opportunity. So the next few pieces are going to be like different looks at that. I really like a couple of pieces by Elaine Hagenberg. Oh Love is here, but also My Companion. And what I appreciate about these two pieces in particular are that the pronouns are non-binary and the pieces are not set in a heteronormative way. They're both love songs, but anybody can sing them and they can sing them to anyone else. And I feel like that is such an important experience because all people deserve love and all people deserve to celebrate their love and all people deserve to sing about their love. And we shouldn't have to come into our choral spaces, which are hopefully spaces where we feel safe and comfortable and protected, and then sing a piece that absolutely speaks to the opposite of who we are as people and eradicates it in some ways. So I really encourage you to look for texts that have non-binary pronouns, because again, amplifying women's voices isn't just about women. That's sort of the work I've been doing this last year, is that looking at this music and thinking about it, you have to think about all of this in an intersectional way. You can't think about anything, it's just race or it's just religion or it's just gender, because it's not. We all need to be inclusive, right? And we need to address and acknowledge that it's, you know, I as a woman don't experience the same thing because I'm white as my colleague and friend who is not white and is female, right? We have to acknowledge that there are differences. So that's part of what some of this rep is for. Andrea Ramsey, who everyone I know loves, she's an MSU Go Green fellow grad, but she also just writes so much great music and so much accessible music, right? Like so great. And don't get me wrong, her SSA stuff is phenomenal. But again, we're going to point out other ways to amplify women's voices. So here are 3 pieces of hers, and she's got more, but 3 pieces of hers that I would recommend for TTB choirs. Tell My Father is like my go-to jam. I've done it with middle schoolers, high schoolers, honor choir, college students. I love that piece so much. But the one I'm going to talk about really quickly is As I Have Loved You. And part of what I love about it is just the way she sets the very opening of it, sets you up for a completely different gender experience. So tenor bass choirs, you know, just like SSA choirs stereotypically sing about love and nature, right? Tenor bass choirs like sing stereotypically like drinking songs in 6/8 or pirate songs, right? Also very gendered and also not great for us as humans. So part of amplifying women's voices is also allowing tenor basses to have a different experience and identify masculinity in a different way. As I Have Loved You starts with this D pedal in the piano, and then the tenors and basses all come in and saying, my command is this, in unison, and then they start overlapping and gaining energy. My command, my command, my command. Super powerful TB sort of opener. And then she just sets it so intuitively, and this is my command is love. And it finally resolves to this beautiful lush chord, and it's like this very emotional, evocative moment in her writing. And imagine what it could be like for your tenor bass singers to be able to express themselves in ways that are not gendered, right? And could be like, my command is to love. I also wanted to talk really quickly about this piece, Remember the Ladies. This is Melissa Dunphy's piece. It's a recent publication. And I think I just want to talk about it really quickly and maybe play a little bit of it, because it's really hard, I think, to find pieces written for SATB choirs or TB choirs that actually have the woman's voice, where like tenors and basses saying, I have, I am, and it's from a woman's perspective. And so this piece does that. It's Remember the Ladies. This is text by Abigail Adams. It's the famous letter she writes to her husband. And it's awesome. I'll just play a little bit for you.
I have sometimes been ready to think that the passion for liberty cannot be equally strong in the breast of those who deprive the fellow creatures of their
Awesome. And if you download this, you can check out all the links and listen to the whole piece, but I just want to give you a snippet of it. But I don't know about you, but to me, it's like, I don't know that I've ever gotten to sing a piece in choir where the tenors and basses were singing from a woman's perspective, like voicing a woman's ideas and thoughts. And I think it's so powerful. Even if you never, and again, how you introduce this in your ensembles is different because it's your level of comfort, the community that you've created in your ensemble. But even if you never say anything about it, even if you just program this piece, right? And like, you don't make a big deal about it, they just do it. Imagine what that experience would be like. Imagine what singing a piece like this every single day or 3 or 4 days a week for 3 months would have on singers. I always say that, as choral conductors, we are literally putting words into our singers' mouths. We're literally telling them what to say and asking them to repeat it over and over and over again, and often memorize it and ingrained in us, right? We become numb to it a little bit. Well, maybe if we help people get so comfortable with giving women voice, then we don't have to make a big deal about it as much, right? Let's go. Another sort of area of intersectionality that I want to talk about really quickly is the idea of religion in choral music. And I just want to talk about this really quickly. This is Umoja, Zenaida Robles. I know Western people are all about Zenaida and her work, as they should be, and everyone should be. And this is just a simple piece of hers. Umoja means unity, and it's the first principle of Kwanzaa. And I always think about, when I was an undergrad, which now feels like a very, very long time ago. When I was an undergrad, I remember, being told you can't call things like, you can't call it your Christmas concert. You have to call it a winter concert because it needs to be representative of more than just one perspective. You can program Christmas music, but you can't call it a Christmas concert. But then now I think about that and it's like, well, if you're only programming Christmas music at your winter concert, is that really any better than just calling it a Christmas concert? Like if we're not really programming, if we're doing a holiday concert, we say we're having a holiday performance, and then we only program music about one holiday, is that really any better? And, so this might be an opportunity to introduce, Kwanzaa is not the same as Christmas. It's a different experience. It's a different culture. Hanukkah is not the biggest Jewish holiday, but it is another one that exists. And there are some really great arrangements of pieces. So if we say we're doing a holiday concert, let's make sure to be inclusive of multiple holidays. Okay, so this is just a kind of like smattering. And again, all this stuff is available online, but those are links to performances of other pieces that I think are representative of this idea. So please check them all out because they're amazing. And some of them are SSA, because I know I didn't talk about any treble music, but please check some of those out. And I've also included a list of links to different composer websites of contemporary composers who identify as women. There are some trans composers in here as well, which I think is also really important. We have trans singers, I have trans singers, and they need to sing music that represents them as well. Okay, so this part. I wanna say first that I want to give a trigger warning because the next piece we're going to talk about, the next two pieces we'll talk about relate specifically to domestic violence. So I just want to prepare anybody who is listening or who listens to this asynchronously at another point, just to know that that's coming. And if that's not something that you are prepared to do, I completely understand. But we can't really talk about issues of inclusivity and equity until we acknowledge that there are problems within our canon, our current canon. It's not just about adding new things. Adding new things is super important, but it's also about going back and saying, we should not be doing this piece anymore. We know better, we need to do better. The first of these pieces that I'm going to talk to you about is Neighbors Chorus. And this comes from one of Offenbach's operettas. And I know that lots of people like this piece, and I know that lots of people do it. And I feel like there's two sides to it. There are people, when I talk about this piece, they go, no one is programming this piece anymore. And then there are people who are definitely still programming this piece and don't know why. It's a big deal. I have adjudicated festivals all over the country and heard it all over the country. I looked up recently to see if there were any like new recordings of it on YouTube. And there are, from as recently as like fall 2019, which is the last time we had live concerts, really. So people are still doing this and we need to talk about it. Specifically, the recording I'm going to share a little bit of today has over 53,000 views. So when we talked about audience before, think about the magnitude of that. 53,000 times this clip, just this version, has been viewed. And what that says and what impact that has. So I'm going to play a little bit. You'll see the text is on the right-hand side, and I will make this smaller so you can see it in case my thing's blocking it. But the text should line up with what you hear. So we'll stop there. And I just want you to think about the context of this text, how it is prepared musically. They sing this forte, like, did you beat her and choke her and knock her all about, and then respond with a, ah. And think about what kind of experience that creates for your students. You know, I understand when people talk about why they do this piece, it's often related to, well, you know, Offenbach is a named composer, and this is a way for my students to experience something from a different time period and a different genre, and we can talk about opera. Other people like it because it's a patter song. And so my response whenever I give this presentation is, to all my composer friends who are listening, please write us new patter songs, so that can no longer be an excuse for why we program this piece, because there aren't any patter songs. So like, let's write a slew of really inclusive, equitable, representative patter songs, so we don't have to talk about this piece ever again. A couple things, you know, when we talked about text earlier, when I started looking into this piece, I looked up the original opera that it comes from and the text itself, the original. And so thinking about, you know, because some people say you can't change a historical piece of music, you shouldn't change the text. Well, it turns out that this is not actually even like a good translation of the original French. The original French actually has way more to do with sex than it does with violence. And I always say that, you know, we could have a whole nother session about why we're willing to talk about beating women, but we're not willing to talk about women's sexuality. But I just want to give you that perspective. So if you love patter songs and you want to do this, then just rewrite the words, right? Like, you don't have to do these words just because the J.W. Pepper published, you know, version that you can access has this text. I wanted to share also some comments from this particular video and to say that these are representative. There's tons of comments in here. And just to kind of give some perspective. This was wonderful. The first group where I could actually hear what they were saying. Of course, the sound was lovely and lively as well, though I feel that this could have been memorized easily. Because it's not bad enough they were making our students sing this day in and day out, but we should make them memorize it and internalize it. Also, I should stop and say really quickly that imagine, try to put yourself in the position of someone who has experienced domestic violence. And they walk into the choral classroom, which is supposed to be a place where they feel safe. And their teacher, who they probably admire and respect, gives them this piece of music. Imagine what impact that would have on a person. To have this safe space just become a place of terror, right? A reminder of a terrible thing that they are living through or have lived through. On the flip side, imagine that you have a group of singers who have no lived experience with domestic violence. And this is their first interaction with it. The first time anybody talks about it or presents it, and it's presented in this farcical, comical way. Imagine what impact that would have on students and how they might interact with people in the future who come to them and say that they are experiencing domestic violence. Right? Again, we numb our students to the texts that we provide them, and we have to think about that. Precise and animated, wonderful work. The tone and swell of this piece is perfect. One of the best recordings. I'm singing this in school. This was from a student. I'm singing this in school, but we're singing it with middle schoolers. So we had to change a lot of the lyrics. We changed beat to meet, knock to talk, joke, choke to joke, etc. It's freaking stupid now. Had to sing this my senior year of high school. It came together nicely, but then a couple students complained, so we scrapped it. It's too bad. The rest of us had fun with this song. Think about what position we're putting our singers in, right? That they have to be the voice that says, we shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't put our students in that position. Why do people flip out about the text? It's just a song. So if you feel like this is a topic you want to cover, then I'm going to offer this piece as a replacement. So this is What I Want, and the music is by Stephen Smith. The text is by Pat Lowther. So anyone who knows, please correct me because I don't know exactly the pronunciation. And Pat was a poet. She lived in Vancouver, and her husband was also a poet. And she was the victim of domestic violence for years. And eventually, she was murdered by her husband, as many domestic violence cases usually result in escalation. This is her poem. These are her words. And it's a different perspective. It doesn't explicitly talk about domestic violence, but you could address her experience with it and with your students. I'll just play a little bit of it. So that's just to give you a little bit of taste of it. But just think about the different perspectives that are represented in that, and the different sort of contexts in which we talk about domestic violence. One, a victim of it, and one, a gossipy mob that is a translation that is not even an accurate one. Just a couple things to think about. You know, if you want to address this with your students, there's some ideas on the left-hand side. But I want to draw your attention to what you see on, hopefully see, let me move this window, on the upper right-hand corner. This is from J.W. Pepper's website. And this is a list of state lists, essentially, that recommend this piece. And SCBA, I'm calling you out, my home state of California, we need to take this off the list. So if you know anybody in any of these states, Georgia, Iowa, Indiana, Kansas, Maryland, North Carolina, New York, or Virginia, help out. Let's get this taken off these lists. This is not a piece that we should be recommending. And, you know, again, each of us as conductors, we need to do the work of looking up this music and really understanding where it's coming from. But we as a choral community also need to do a better job about what we recommend and going back and looking at what we used to recommend and making sure that it's still appropriate. All right. The next piece we're going to talk about is Anai Woman. And this is an SSA arrangement by Susan Borwick of a Sojourner Truth speech that she gave. And I am going to, I'm going to walk the walk because I'm talking the talk. This is a piece that I have programmed a lot. I have done it with students at middle school level, high school, all sorts of things, because it's this really you know, an empowering text, right? And the text is by a woman of color. And I thought I was doing a really good job. And pedagogically, the piece is really great for teaching. There's so many good things about it. So let me play a little bit of it, and then I'm going to tell you why we shouldn't do it anymore. Okay, so that's just a little bit of it. It's really catchy. Again, pedagogically speaking, it's a great piece to introduce. But Sojourner Truth, this is not actually her speech. So I'm going to read a little bit from, this information comes from the Sojourner Truth Project. And I'll read it word for word because I want to make sure that I don't misrepresent it. The popular but inaccurate version was written and published in 1863. Notice that the date of the actual speech was 1851. So 12 years after Sojourner gave the Anai Woman speech, a white abolitionist named Frances Dana Barker Gage rewrote the text. Curiously, Gage not only changed all of Sojourner's words, but chose to represent Sojourner speaking in a stereotypical Southern Black slave accent, rather than in Sojourner's distinct Upper New York State Low Dutch accent. Frances Gage's actions were well-intended and served the suffrage and women's rights movements at the time. However, by today's standards of ethical journalism, her actions were a gross misrepresentation of Sojourner Truth's words and identity. By changing Truth's words and her dialect to that of a stereotypical Southern slave, Frances Gage effectively erased Sojourner's Dutch heritage and her authentic voice, as well as unintentionally adding to the oversimplification of the American slave culture and furthering the eradication of our nation's Northern slave history. Frances Gage admitted that her amended version had given but a faint sketch of Sojourner's original speech, but she felt justified and believed her version stronger and more palatable to the American public than Sojourner's original version. That's powerful. And, you know, I programmed this piece. Again, I didn't do my research, and it really wasn't even that hard to find this. it was simply like looking up the speech to get a little bit more information about Sojourner truth. And that's how I stumbled upon this website and this project and this research. And I was like, oh my gosh, you know, like I have been doing this and perpetuating this. You know, we have to think about it. So Frances Gage appropriates this speech, removes any part of Sojourner's real identity from it. She, as a white woman, like, rewrites it. And then a white woman sets this text. And then I, as a white woman, then conducted it and directed it and asked my singers to sing it. So it's very problematic in so many ways. I want to show you the comparison on the left and right. Right is what Frances Gage created, and the version everybody knows, the version that if you look this speech up on YouTube, you will find fantastic actresses doing this as a monologue because they don't know, right? On the left is Marius Robinson's transcription. And it's believed that they actually worked together on this a couple days after the original speech to capture what the original text was, and they worked on it together because she didn't have the ability to read and write. And so this is what we believe is the closest to the actual original version of the speech. And you can see some of the differences between the two. Again, some optional lesson plans for anyone who's looking for it and some resources. Please check out the Sojourner Truth Project. A couple more things really quickly because I want to make sure we have time for questions. I gave you some repertoire, some composer things to check out. I've actually created a resource document that you can find on my website, or I'll share it today with anybody who wants it. But here are also some playlists and podcasts to check out that highlight all sorts of different marginalized populations, not just women. So check any of those out. The playlists on the left, there's some really great ones. Podcasts on the right, some of which you'll know many people who are a participant, and so please check them out. And then you can click on this; that'll take you to the document, which has tons of repertoire resources, databases you can go to, classroom tools you can use, all sorts of stuff. So that, I'm going to stop sharing. Yay! I got through it really fast. Okay. That is just some of the information. So please let me know if you have any questions.
Dr. Cossey, this is fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Fielding a couple right now. The first is kind of centered in around your recommended repertoire slide, which I thought was very impactful. But in kind of crafting this checklist, who are some of the models that you borrowed or cited in crafting this philosophical repertoire checklist?
So this is just something, I was talking to my colleague and one of my best friends, Stacy Kakawa. She's from the California area, teaches in Fullerton. And I was talking to her about this session, and actually it was her suggestion, because I was talking about what I was wanting to do. And she said, well, maybe not everybody thinks about programming the same way you do. Maybe you should include your process, like how you think about it. And so it's not something that I could cite like a specific example. It's just over years of teaching and work and learning that I really just tried to think of, like, how can I best do this work? So it doesn't come from any one specific place. It's something that I'm sure I glean from lots of different places. And that's just kind of a bit of my process.
I just thought it was so great because it was a clear representation, especially throughout this virtual series, that our approach to making equity actionable and our process in celebrating diversity is also diverse in and of itself, right? Mm-hmm. There's not necessarily one correct way to do it, but perhaps something that is infinite in scope that can still speak to our own specific creativity and educational philosophies as well. Another question that we received was around your discussion of the repertoire checklist. So mm-hmm. As you were kind of discussing these checklists, you also were very vulnerable in talking about or connecting these to, missteps or mistakes that you've made along the way.
Yeah.
So Could you kind of share like your philosophy or what it's like or the importance of sharing that type of like your mistakes or your missteps in a vulnerable way? Why is it so important?
I think that's an amazing question. I think for me personally, it's about accountability. I mean, if I'm going to stand up in front of a group of people or in a virtual world and make suggestions, I can't act like I know everything because I absolutely don't. And I am learning literally every day. Every time I present this, I'm like, ooh, I should probably do it. Like, I'm learning every day. And I think it's important also, we say to our students all the time, we say to them, like, don't be afraid to fail, right? Because that's how you learn. That's how you get better in an ensemble. That's how you get better as a musician. Well, it's the same for us, right? Like, I've made mistakes. That's okay. I'm learning from them. I'm getting better. I'm not going to do them again. I'm going to share what I can with other people. And also, it's not othering. I feel like sometimes we point fingers in our effort to do good work, and we say, we shame people. And, it's not about shaming people. It's about sharing information and acknowledging, like, yeah, I do not know everything. I don't even know, Chris Peterson always says, you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know what you don't, like all these things, right? Well, you can't blame someone, for not knowing, but when we realize, we have to acknowledge it, we have to own it, we have to call ourselves out, in order to get better. I don't know if that answers it.
No, I think you did in such a very beautiful way. This is a good one. In 10 years from now, if this work were to take root, what does the Reimagined choral ensemble look like?
I mean, ideally, it's a place where we don't have to have sessions like this anymore, right? Like, because it's part of just how we make music. We don't have to intentionally program, marginalized voices, because it's built into how we're already programming it. And so it's not like, so it's just not a thing we talk about anymore. Ideally, that's what I'd like. I'd like it to become so ubiquitous and so common and so a part of how all people approach choral music that we don't have to identify it anymore in that way.
I mean, that's just such a fabulous response, because it immediately connects to the whole point of score study as well, right? In making equity actionable and making all of this work exist in a headspace to what I call a do space, it has to connect to these facets in the craft in which we hold dearly, right? And one thing that I was so moved from was just from the story of how in our score study, our approach to intersectional ideas of finding truth within the identity of women, finding truth within the identity of women of color, finding truth within the identity of trans women. Perhaps there are limitations in how we were taught to study a score that would, prevent aspects of harm, specifically around the wrongfully cited text that you've discussed. So once you kind of learn from these mistakes, which we've all made, I've made them too. If you were to recreate steps of creating a philosophy of score study that goes deep and that prevents this type of harm that has been done within the choral craft, what are some actionable steps that we could take and put into our score study for the fall?
I mean, it's like I said with Anai Woman, and I think this is the question a lot of people ask, because let's be honest, who has any more time, right? Our jobs are really hard, and we have to acknowledge that as a profession, because we expect every person to know everything about it, and that's not realistic, and that's not helpful. So, I, as someone who works at a university, have access to different academic resources. I can look things up differently, but I found this by doing a Google search, like super basic, right? Shame on me for not doing a Google search before. So it doesn't have to be, necessary, and you don't have to take that on. Part of the reason I keep expanding, and I used to have slides for my resources, but they just keep getting bigger. I can't fit them all on. So part of it is culling through, resources that have done some of that work for you, right? So starting, like, where do you start? I think that's a good place. Sorry, I'm kind of meandering because it's a giant question. So important though. I think where we start looking is the first thing. Like so many of us, I mean, when I was teaching middle school and high school, there was a JW Pepper like warehouse that I could drive to on the weekend. And I would like go and just walk up and down the aisles and like pull stuff out of the shelves and sit down at a piano and pretend I could play it and go through the piece. And that's where I found most of my rep those first couple of years. Okay, but now there's like so many more resources that are available to us. And so where we start our look, I think is really important. And making sure that those sources are ones that are doing work to be equitable and give voice to voiceless populations for a really long time. So that's part of it. And part of it is doing a little bit of that work on our own.
Yes, I love that. And also love how you brought up the fact of doing a Google search, right? Because perhaps that's something that we have to acknowledge is as your craft is expanding, right? The resources or how we kind of garner our information must also open its arms out into the universe, right? Like,
yeah,
we become so technologically connected during this time to the point where this conversation would have not happened, right?
right.
You know, before before the 2010s or what have you.
Right.
And also something that I'm kind of learning from you is that for us to truly step into a space of inclusion, our resources also exist outside of the book, right? Our resources come from our conversations, right? Our resources come from the community outside of us, right? Our resources come from our colleagues who are doing the work, right?
Yep.
And so I just really appreciate that learning for me is that from you is that, you know, in order for this work to take root, we have to connect to each other.
Yes. Yes. Well said.
Your content. So thank you for that. Another question that we received was a kind of a testimony. Your comment about feeling seen from a university woman identifying conductor resounded with me. I have a question specifically around the training of women identifying conductors and how we conceived our craft with conducting and how we conceive our craft in mentorship. What can we do better and what is the next steps in this arena?
Okay, I'm cognizant that this is going up on like YouTube, but I'm just gonna state the things. I'm already this far in, okay? So first of all, I'm so glad it resonated with you, and I hope that that was a good, positive resonation. Resonation, is that a word? I don't know.
Sure.
Resonance, there you go. Okay, can we start by stop talking about what women wear when they conduct? I don't understand why what I wear has any impact or why anybody feels the need to talk about it. And it has been commented on so many times in my professional career, from conducting at a middle school SCBA festival where the judge comments that, well, your students are dressed up, you should be too, when I'm wearing a full suit. But that's apparently not dressed up. To a couple of years ago when I was conducting also at a festival, but for community choirs. And this woman from the audience came up to me at the end of the performance and said, and I thought she was coming to say something nice, because it was truly like the whole thing was about like sharing and community. It wasn't a competition. It was just like, let's get all these community choirs together. And this woman said to me, she's like, I was so distracted because your jacket was short. And every time you move hands, I see your butt. And I was like taken aback. And I never do this, but I responded, and I never do this. And I was like, well, it's a good thing I have a nice butt. And I like walked away because I'm so tired of being talked. Like, I attended a Chorus America event and a conducting event. And the very first day, they pulled all of the women who were participating aside and took us into a room after the day and talked to us about what was not appropriate that we were wearing. And this was led by other women, right? So part of it has to start with, and I know that's just one thing, right? But part of it just has to start there. Like, I'm not invisible. I'm literally standing on a stage waving my hands. Like, you can't pretend that I'm not there. So if I wear a backless dress, or I wear a suit, or my hair is up or my hair is down, like at my recitals, I've had to have conversations about like, well, is your hair going to be up or down? Because that has an impact. I'm like, do you have these conversations with all of your students, or is it just because I'm a woman? Right? Like, so sorry if that was a tangent and didn't quite address the
No,
thing.
I think you did it. It specifically centers in around a book that that I'm thinking of about. The title of the book is called Bodies Out of Bounds, right? And when we spend so much of our time policing our bodies instead of celebrating them, you know, all of that mental energy of that and what we consider quote unquote professional, that energy and those resources could be spent or connected to the study of a score, the expansion of musical opportunity for all, right? And so I think that is a great starting point for us to consider in our work in the future, something that's very actionable. How do we discuss bodies in our craft? And how in our discussion of bodies does that lead to points of boundary and also harm for women identifying students? And so, you know, I thank you so much for that story, because I learned something from that, and I appreciate your vulnerability, Dr. Cossey. I just, before we close this space, everyone, can we all just give Dr. Cossey a round of applause? The crowd goes wild. Friends, thank you so much for spending time with us for our virtual DEI series. Please catch us next in early May on the 7th. That's a Friday, May 7th. That's a Friday from 6 to 7 Pacific Standard Time, where we will feature our next guest, Dr. Corinne Duffy from the University of Montana, who will partner with K-12 educators from the Western region and talk about the importance of mentorship in connection to our work in DEI. So with all of that said, Dr. Cossey, thank you so much for your wisdom and your scholarship and your artistry. And for everyone else that's tuning in, whether you're synchronous or asynchronous, have a fantastic day. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye.